I was 14 when I met him. I was an add-on to a service trip that my youth group was going on. My family couldn't afford, but a wealthier kid had gotten sick, and I was able to take his place. He was a smart and charismatic and caring person. He spoke in a way that when he preached, everybody listened. He had a laugh that could shake the entire room. He had that personality that really just drew you in. He was not my pastor. He was the pastor of the service trip. He coordinated with all of the other youth groups in our area and brought his own. My own church stopped going on that trip. I wouldn't know why for many years. When my church stopped going, he had taken an interest in me, and he said, "Why don't you come with my youth group? You can be one of our youth, and I will scholarship you so you don't have to worry about paying." He, over the years, sent me letters and gifts and books and told me that he really cared about my well-being. My senior year of high school, things were not going well. I overdosed on drugs. I was in the hospital unconscious for days. And when I woke up, I found that they don't actually let you go home. You have to go to an inpatient facility. During the time between me waking up and the time that I was transferred to an inpatient facility, my youth pastor that initially took me on that trip and him both came to visit me. They said that they wanted to make sure that I was doing well. I appreciated that. When I came out of my inpatient facility, I had found some healing. I was starting to do well, and it was noticeable, at least according to the people around me. He was one of those people. He said that he noticed a difference, he wanted to help me, and he would like to meet with me on a regular basis to talk about spirituality. I was not in a place in my life where I thought that was what I really wanted to do, and so I said, thanks, but no thanks. Then came my time in college. I was in a class that required me to have interview a leader. And so I called him and I said, hey, can I interview you? And he said, absolutely, but you're gonna have to follow up and meet with me about spirituality. And I said, okay, that seemed fair. And so he came that first meeting to a diner next to my college, and we had dinner. We talked mostly about what I needed for my assignment. And then he told me a little bit about his life. From there, our next meeting, we text back and forth to set up, and we decided on a Starbucks. When I got to Starbucks, he said it was a little too crowded inside, so we should go meet outside and in his car. I said, okay. I looked around, it didn't look that crowded, but I could understand talking about difficult topics and needing some privacy. When we got to his car, we talked a little bit about my life and the challenges that I had had, and then he put his hand on my leg, and we talked mainly about the challenges and difficulties he was having in his marriage. It felt uncomfortable for me, and I thought, maybe this is just me being weird. I've never been a touchy-feely person, so this is probably just me. After all, this is a pastor who is trying to save me. He couldn't mean anything by it. And another part of me felt honored. Here is this big, powerful pastor, right, who has decided to share with me all of the personal challenges and struggles that he's having. For me, I felt like, wow, like maybe this is how he's trying to tell me he too can understand my struggles. From there, the next meeting that we had, he said he wanted to take me to a film in the city. I said, sure. We met at the bottom of a hotel bar. We drank coffee, but he told me he'd already told the server I was his daughter, so if I wanted alcohol, that'd be okay. In that meeting, he asked me, are you sure this isn't going to mess anything up for you? And I said, yeah, I already told you I don't have class today. We were talking in English, but we were speaking two very different languages. From there, we went to the Strand bookstore, and then he took me to the theater. Once we were inside the theater, he started to touch me, kiss me, and more. We ended the evening in a diner where he told me God was telling him this was the way he was going to heal me. And then he gave me $100, sent me on my way, and said the next time that we met, it had to be for real sex, whatever that meant. Our relationship continued on like that for several years. He would come to my dorm and pick me up. He would drive away to a motel that he felt was far enough away he couldn't be recognized. Or when short on time, he'd find a side street and we'd go on a car date. Sometimes he was polite, sometimes he was violent. All of the time it would be abuse, but I wouldn't understand that yet. When this pastor took an interest in me and my life, I felt special. It took me a while to end that relationship. When I finally did, it was because I had finally figured out that I was moving in a better direction for my life, that I didn't want to live in a secret relationship and have all of these mysterious and volatile relationships. So I ended my relationship with him, and I stopped attending church. Years later, I reconnected with him, and I told him, what you did to me was wrong. He said, I know. I'm sorry. I made an incredibly selfish mistake, and it will never happen again because I am retiring. And I believed him. Hurricane Sandy brought me back into the church. My former youth pastor, now an ordained elder, was now the lead pastor of his own church, and they had created a feeding center for the people impacted by the hurricane. I would cook breakfast on Saturdays and Sundays, and since I was already there on Sundays, I would continue and stay for church. As we were in a church service several months into this feeding center, my former youth pastor announced in church that they were going on this service trip and that they needed chaperones. I reached out to my pastor after that and I said, wait, how is this possible? Because I know that pastor retired. And he said, good news, he's coming back in July. And my heart just sank. It took me a few weeks, but eventually I told my former youth pastor that about my relationship and what had happened. He said he was angry with the abusive pastor, but that he was still sending his youth. At the same time, I learned about the complaint process in the United Methodist Church. I went to him and I asked him, why did you not tell me about this? And he said he didn't know. Years later, I found out he was actually the chair for our conference committee on investigation. He said he wanted to help me with my complaint, and so I should send it to him when I was ready if I wanted to move forward. I did. Within minutes of me emailing him, I had a phone call from him, and he said, what exactly is your end goal? And I said, I just think that he shouldn't be allowed to work with youth. That makes sense, right? And he said, you know what? How about I set up an informal agreement between the two of you? He'll agree not to work with youth if you'll agree not to file a complaint, as if justice was never something I deserved. Young, naive, and traumatized, I'd agree. Later that summer, I found out he was still running that service trip. There were pictures of him online attending. So I filed my complaint. My former youth pastor was furious with me. He stopped talking to me the day I met with my bishop. He then would tell me 6 months later it was because I had betrayed him by filing. I think he betrayed me by never having my best interest at heart. When this pastor took an interest in me in my life, I felt special. I thought that this man cared about me and wanted to help me heal. I didn't realize at the time it was abuse. Clergy abuse is defined as any abuse perpetrated by a ministerial leader with someone that leader has power over. While my specific experience involves sexual abuse, anytime a clergy person uses their power and influence over a vulnerable person, they have perpetrated an abuse. This type of abuse is so harmful because of the spiritual component to it. Oftentimes, clergy persons are looked at as a representation of God, so it is as if God himself had perpetrated that abuse. This abuse is also harmful because when a person of faith is struggling, the people that they go to are their church members, they are their church leaders, but when the problem is the leader, is the person causing the harm, they now have no one to go to. When I reported this abusive pastor and filed my formal complaint, I lost my entire faith community. Some couldn't believe he could ever do something like that. Others thought it was true, but didn't think I was worth the hassle. I heard things from other clergy like, nothing really wrong happened. You were 18 by the time you had sex. Or, he said he was sorry. What more do you want? Probably most egregious. Sometimes the things that make the best pastors' wives don't always translate in the bedroom, so sometimes these things happen. When all of the leaders that you look up to are telling you these things, it is so hard for you to trust yourself. I thought I was a monster that took this man away from his calling. I thought that God was angry with me for messing with one of his people. I get asked all the time, how did you heal and come back? No one ever really likes the answer because there's no quick fix. It's a lot of time, it's a lot of patience for me and everyone else who had to deal with me, and a lot of love. I have a lot of thoughts about the complaint process in the United Methodist Church, but one of the things I think they get really, really right is the assignment of, if you ask, and only if you ask, a support person to go through the complaint process with you. I wasn't quite sure what that meant, but I asked for one. My complaint happened to go through the whole process fairly quickly. Because of the screenshots and evidence that I provided, the whole process was less than a month long. The second that the abusive pastor was faced with a formal complaint, he turned in his credentials and surrendered. I got an email from my bishop that said the same thing, and I took that email and I forwarded it to that support person, and I said, well, I guess I won't be needing you. And she said, wait, that's not how it works. I'm here to help you heal. I'd like to still talk to you. And I said, okay. So she called me once a week. We'd sit in mostly silence until I felt comfortable. And we continued on like that for several years. About 2 years in, I got to the point where I really wanted to start to think about faith and spirituality again. And so I told her that, and she introduced me to another one of her clergy colleagues that was very caring and kind. And we talked about faith. She helped me to really think about and relearn my own faith. It took about 5 years before I stepped foot in a church again. But I am. I'm now an active member of a vibrant church in Maplewood, New Jersey. I am also in a human development PhD program where I am studying clergy-perpetrated sexual abuse, institutional response, and how that response impacts a person's faith, their spirituality, and their level of post-traumatic growth. I now know that figuring out how churches can respond to abuse in a healthy way, or hopefully prevent it, is my life passion. I have not yet collected data for my dissertation, but if you are a survivor or you know someone who is that might want to share their story, send them my way. I'd love to talk to them. While I don't have any quantifiable data right now as to what survivors find to be the most helpful for healing, I have a few suggestions from my own experience. How a church responds to abuse can have a huge impact on how a survivor feels about God, about faith, about church. Responding well means the difference between a person fully healing, coming back to church or not, and more importantly, about how that person feels about having any kind of faith after. If you're a survivor, you get to choose and decide whether you would like to return to church. It's not mandatory. You figure out what feels comfortable for you. I stayed away from a church for a very long time. But I can assure you, when I came back in a completely different way. I did not find a church based physically on that proximity of what was close to me. I made a list of the things that I wanted, and I interviewed the pastors of each of those churches. And when I interviewed them, there was one pastor who answered every single one of my questions perfectly. That's the church that I now attend. If a survivor decides a faith community is not the right fit for them, that's okay too. It's not necessary for a survivor to return to church. Sometimes I think that's hard for clergy to hear. As a survivor, you get to choose the rest of your life path, and for some, being inside a church just might not be it. My hope is that survivors always sort of find their way to what feels good and safe. If you are a clergy person, you have a large role to play in keeping your church safe. The best thing you can do is to make sure you are healthy, you hold healthy boundaries, and seek assistance when you don't feel your best, because that is often where abuse begins. Then you work to make and keep your church a healthy, healing community survivors of abuse can feel safe in. You may not always know when a survivor is in your congregation, but you should always assume there's a high probability and that they are. You can signal to survivors that you are a safe space based on how you behave. You can do trainings on abuse in your church. You can do trainings on healthy boundaries with all of your congregational leaders. You can announce publicly and openly if something does occur in your church. You can also make sure that you first believe a survivor always and get them the help that you need. I think oftentimes clergy think that they can do everything and can be everything, but one of the best things that you can do is refer out, get that person some assistance, because you're actually not fully trained and equipped to handle that kind of abuse unless you have a degree in that, right? The other thing you can do is talk about abuse, clergy abuse in your church from your pulpit. So often we hear about all of the ills of the world, right? You've heard sermons, you've preached sermons on poverty, on racism, on human trafficking, on suicide, right? Think about the last time you heard or you yourself preached about clergy abuse in your church. We can't fix and solve problems that we can't talk about. So many times I'll talk to clergy and laity, and they'll say they don't want to talk about it just in case someone then thinks it must be happening in their church. That actually can't be further from the truth. By talking about this openly in your church, you signal to survivors that it is okay to talk about. We can have the hard conversations. And by doing that, you can truly create a safe church. Thank you.